I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Holly Bowen. She is an assistant professor of psychology at Southern Methodist University. Holly is an expert in emotional memory and how emotion and motivation influence how we form memories and remember past experiences, and how these cognitive processes change with age. Holly, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thanks for having me.
How did you first become interested in emotion and memory?
So I think this actually really started when I got to grad school. Um, I did an undergrad thesis and a couple of independent research projects, but they were on something totally different. So my honors thesis was actually in human sexuality. Um, but I had done some work in a cognition lab. And when I got to grad school, I was interested in cognition. And I think just the lab that I was in really helped shape pretty much all of my research interests moving forward. And my advisor, Julia Spaniel, had done some work on emotional memory. And so I got interested in that aspect of memory when I got to grad school. And that's also how I got interested in aging. Had no prior research interest in aging, hadn't really taken a class on aging before. But she's an expert on aging. And so I got really into that when I got to grad school.
I didn't know that about the earlier human sexuality focus, but in that way, there's more overlap between our interests than I thought. And it seems to have gone in the opposite direction because I came to grad school applying to study adolescent emotional development. And then from there, I started learning more about how hormones change emotion processing during puberty. And that was mostly based on animal research because you want these experimental models. And then so much of the animal research concerning puberty also had to do with how sex hormones are changing sexual behavior, which is less talked about in humans, but it makes sense given the focus on reward system development during adolescence and how that feeds in to risk taking. And I started reading evolutionary psychology as well, how in this top-down ultimate way, you could argue that everything to do with status seeking might have to do with mating psychology. So that's a completely different rabbit hole. But it's interesting to me that you started there and followed the rabbit hole down the other direction to come to emotion and motivation more broadly.
Yeah, so my undergrad thesis, if I can remember, you know, was was more about sexual risky behavior, but more so from a cognitive perspective and how people kind of separate, how they would think about things, you know, outside of that context and say, yes, of course, this is a risky behavior. But then in the context of, an intimate setting, kind of sort of lose that aspect of it where they start to make decisions that they wouldn't make outside of that context and sort of think about things in a different way. So that was my starting point anyway.
I see really clearly the connection there to emotion, motivation, decision making. How did the memory component specifically come in?
So I had done a little bit of work as an undergrad in this cognition lab where we were looking at memory performance for people who were singing in choirs versus people who didn't have any musical background. And I don't remember that we found anything particularly interesting there, but that's how I sort of got interested in memory. It's that one project where my advisor had already collected all the data and I just analyzed it and wrote up a little report for an independent project.
Was the theory there that people who are musically trained might have better memory specifically if it's something to do with music or tone or something like that?
That might have been the theory. That wasn't what we tested. We were just looking at memory performance on sort of typical like neurocognitive tests, sort of general memory abilities that we didn't, as far as I can remember,
Uh-huh.
didn't really find anything interesting there.
That's interesting because I'm trying to grasp. This wasn't with neuroimaging data, right? This was behavioral.
No, it was all behavioral. Yeah. I
Uh-huh.
didn't get into neuroimaging till grad school.
Like this is pretty tangential, but it's reminding me of these fusiform face area studies where there's this brain region that's optimized for detecting faces, but then people did a bunch of follow-up experiments on people with pretty random expert trained specialties like bird watchers or car enthusiasts. And it turns out that the face area, it's not necessarily just for faces, but for anything that's really like particular categorization. And I wonder if there could be something similar going on with people who are musically trained, or if it's just a different categorical way of thinking, that could have trickle down effects onto memory.
Yeah, that's possible. I guess you would have to think of a way to think of music or musical training in the same way that you might think of, bird expertise. Um, I think having musical training is more probably more broad than that, but I'd have to think about some more how it would
Yeah,
fit
I
into
know
that.
you see other interesting neuroimaging findings with connectivity and musical training. So like between auditory cortex and motor
Mhm,
cortex, especially if it's something like violin players where you need really
mhm.
fine-tuned motor skills.
Yes, I am a violin player, actually.
Oh, really? Yeah, so your brain would look a little different. And there's something with the lateralization that comes out differently as well, isn't there?
With musical training, you mean?
Right.
I'm not as familiar with the neuroscience of musical training, and its effects on the brain. And this is something I did a long time ago, so
Uh-huh.
I'm not the right
Yeah,
expert for that.
yeah, back to your world on memory. Okay, so you started getting interested in emotion and its ties to memory in grad school. You also started doing neuroimaging. What was the theory behind what you were trying to look for in the brain?
So the neuroimaging study that I did in grad school was focused more on motivation effects on memory. So we were looking at reward motivation, specifically monetary reward motivation on memory performance in younger versus older adults. And there had been some work that had come out with younger adults showing that if you told, told people, remember this image, and if you remember it, I'm going to give you $5, that in fact people do remember this $5 images much better than something that was tied to no reward or a lower reward. And so we were looking at these processes in older adults, specifically looking at age differences. And there were reasons to think that beyond just cognitive and memory changes that can happen with age, that there may also be changes to motivational processing. So, for example, older adults typically have lower levels of dopamine, tonic levels of dopamine in the brain, and that's one of the main neurotransmitters associated with reward processing. And so there hadn't been any work done on this in neuroimaging. And so we were interested in looking at what was going on in what I'll call reward network, and whether that could be influenced by age, and whether older adults would show a similar pattern to younger adults where reward motivation, or they'd still be sensitive to reward motivation despite some of these changes, and show an influence of reward motivation on memory.
So I could think of a few competing hypotheses for when you have this better memory for something that's rewarded. Like one could be this reward system dopaminergic effect, maybe like dopamine prediction error on reward learning. So it's really at the level of memory encoding and something different is happening. Or it could be an artifact of attention because people are just paying better attention with the reward, but not necessarily anything to do with dopamine at the encoding stage. Are you able to tease apart those two explanations with this paradigm?
Yeah, so we've done a couple of other studies to actually tap into that question of whether this is just prioritized encoding, some sort of attention effect, where they're intently trying to encode the high reward items and maybe just ignoring, or they don't have a good strategy for the low reward items, compared to maybe a consolidation story, where we only see these effects come out after some kind of retention interval where the high priority, high reward information is solidified in memory to a greater extent than low reward. And so, one of the first studies that we did in this line of work was to test that question specifically. And to do that, we did a very similar paradigm as we've done in the scanner, but this is just behavioral. So participants, we had younger and older adults, encoded images that were paired with either a high reward or a low reward. And then half of the items were tested immediately and half of the items were tested the next day. So if it's just an effect on encoding or attention or something like that, we would expect that these reward effects would come out even on an immediate test of memory. But if it's actually dependent on consolidation processes, kind of hippocampally dependent consolidation processes that take time to unfold, then we might not see an effect right after encoding, but would only see an effect of high versus low value on memory after a period of consolidation. And that is exactly what we found for both age groups. So we don't see an effective reward on an immediate test of memory, even though memory performance, overall is much greater as you might expect. We only see the effect after a 24-hour delay. In our neuroimaging study where we replicated this effect, we didn't have the manipulation of retention intervals. So we only tested participants' memory 24 hours later, and we find the effect behaviorally there as well.
Does this map on to any animal or cellular level studies about, you mentioned dopamine's role in the reward network? Does it have any unique impacts on hippocampus in consolidation that's been experimentally manipulated?
Um, Off the top of my head, I don't know about experimental manipulations of dopamine, but certainly there is animal work to suggest that dopamine, is important for cognitive processing, especially in, you can see these effects, for example, in Parkinson's disease. That's not animal models, but in Parkinson's disease, where there are lower levels of dopamine, often people with Parkinson's disease have cognitive symptoms as well that may be tied to that.
Hmm. Now, this aging effect that you talk about, uh, there tend to be these kind of separate camps when people talk about aging in a developmental context or like an older adults Alzheimer's type aging context. So I'm used to the former camp, and I know how reward processing changes from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, and you tend to see this peak in adolescence that might be partially driven by puberty, sex hormones, peer influence, stuff like that. Um, but that's pretty separate from the aging brain hypothesis that has to do more with these hippocampal changes. Is that the type that you're referring to? Was it much older adults who displayed this effect?
So the interesting thing that we find, and this has been kind of across studies, is that when we're comparing younger versus older adults, and what I mean by younger versus older, younger like 18 to 35-ish, and older meaning 60 or 65 and older. Um, when we're comparing just activation in sort of midbrain regions that you associate with reward, we actually don't find that activation is different between younger and older adults. So when we give them these cues of $5 or 1 cent, the brain areas that are active during that processing, during that reward anticipation stage, are not different between younger and older adults. And so this suggests that, older adults can still process and are still sensitive to rewards, and that their brain doesn't seem to show age-related changes that you might expect, at least when you're talking about activation in those regions.
And their behavior is also the same?
So we see overall memory performance is, declines in older adults, but we still are able to see the effect of reward on memory, meaning they're able to remember more high reward items compared to low reward items, which is the same effect we see in younger adults. It's just overall their memory performance is lower. So
Mhm.
there's sort of a main effect of age, but we still see this difference between high and low reward.
Uh-huh. That's interesting that the activity is the same despite the overall decline in memory. Because sometimes you see these paradoxical effects, like people often talk about fMRI activity, like less is worse, more is better, is more involved. But then other times you see the paradoxical effect, like with violin players, the auditory motor activity goes down with expertise because they just start to get so much more specialized and it's not requiring as much blood flow. And I think in some memory tasks, you might see the same. Like if you're struggling with memory more, you actually see more activity rather than less. But the funny thing is, it seems to depend on just the context and the interpretation. I don't know if you know any a priori heuristics for when you're going to predict more versus less activity corresponding to better versus worse functioning.
So with aging, that's a really interesting question. And people often, talk about compensatory mechanisms, for example, that may boost older adults' performance. They look similar to younger adults, but they're able to do that because they're bringing on board additional neural resources, s- particularly in prefrontal cortex, for example. And we do find that in our studies as well. So even though when they're processing those motivational cues during that reward anticipation stage, their brain looks very similar to younger adults, when we bring in the memory part and we look at what's actually supporting memory performance in this task and that memory for those high value items, then we start to see a little bit of difference between younger and older adults. Their older adults are bringing on board areas of prefrontal cortex that younger adults are not. So, in order to get that same effect that we see behaviorally for younger and older adults require a little bit more neural activity in regions that younger adults are not activating. And particularly, this is in prefrontal cortex and functional connectivity between um, the putamen and prefrontal cortex is where we find that that particular connectivity supports older adults' memory for those high value items, but not younger adults.
You see the same thing in reverse with child development. It's interesting. You can get similar task performance to adults at an earlier age than you see similar neural performance. So like their brain has to work harder when it's still developing, particularly these underdeveloped prefrontal cortex regions, work harder to achieve the same goal, but they can achieve the same goal.
Yeah, exactly. So older adults can do it. They just need a little help from their prefrontal cortex in ways that younger adults don't.
Are you familiar with these dual systems or triadic models of risk taking?
Not really, no.
So the basic one, the dual systems, it refers to this striatal reward network. So that's like the motivation piece. And then you have the prefrontal cortex inhibitory control network. And you can imagine those are in constant tension. So if reward wins out, then you make the decision. If inhibition wins out, then you don't. So dual systems there. And also depending on the balance of those, depending on maturation, like if the subcortical reward striatum develops earlier in adolescence compared to prefrontal cortex, which is still developing into your 20s. That's one of the theories for why you see increased risk taking in adolescence. That's pretty well established. And then more fringe is this triadic model, which says there's the same thing, but the amygdala is also involved. And the amygdala, in the same way that the striatum is sending reward signals up to the cortex, amygdala is sending, like we hear about amygdala in context of fear and aggression and threat, but here they're saying it's more generally loss calculation. So triadic model, it's working in the same way that the striatum does. So the argument is striatum responds to more positive reward, amygdala responds more to, well, threat, but hypothetically anything that's even remotely loss threatening, like losing money in one of these fMRI scan games. And I know there's a lot of research on the amygdala in emotional memory, but it's usually more to do with fear conditioning, threat. And I'm wondering, just theoretically, how you think about interactions between all of these. Is it more like this triadic model where, say, you have prefrontal cortex or hippocampus separately, but then amygdala corresponds to negative, striatum corresponds to positive, and they're working in opposition? I know other people have argued that both of them are just inherently valenced systems, and the fact that the amygdala responds more to these threat-based or fear-based cues, it might not even be that it's optimized for that so much as it's just a valence system. But in general, we have the separate negativity bias, which there are evolutionary incentives to have a negativity bias.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And something that I think about a lot are these valence differences, as well as I'm really interested in sort of getting back into this a little bit now is, how unique are emotion and reward motivation, or are we actually just kind of talking about the same thing? And so in terms of, valence differences in the amygdala, I wouldn't go as far as to say the amygdala is only responsive to negative valence, whether that's, negative emotion or a loss or a punishment in some way. I think there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that the amygdala responds to positive information as well. It may need to be higher in arousal to get that activation. There's also some work from, I believe, from like monkey work showing that certain areas of the hippocampus that we can't image in humans necessarily, like basolateral amygdala, might be more responsive to negative valence than positive, or maybe only responsive to negative, but we can't quite get at that in humans without doing some sort of intracranial recording.
Mhm. Cool. It's still hard for me to think of what is the amygdala doing with positive valence, and I think that might just be because every psych undergrad and then even in grad student, it's like hammered into you, amygdala, fear and aggression, negative valence, and now we're like at the cutting edge of research and there's a lot of open questions.
Yes. And going back to the striatum question, I think you also can get, reward network activation even during a loss, motivation cue, and even during, loss outcomes as well. So I wouldn't
Uh-huh.
necessarily tie that to a specific valence
Right.
either. Yeah.
So here's why this is so tough for me because I was able to sort of get over this uh, binary thinking of positive striatum, amygdala negative, and saying, okay, both do both, but then the optimization must be different. So striatum must be more optimized for, say, learning and decision making, and amygdala must be more optimized for memory. But of course, amygdala is involved in decision making as well. And now I'm even learning from you that striatum's involved in memory. So that seems to confuse it even more for me. And how do you think about those two, amygdala and striatum? What is the big conceptual difference now that we're discussing there's actually a lot of overlap between those?
Yeah. So yeah, as I said, one of the things I'm interested in looking at is really what are the similarities and differences, at least in terms of the way that we think about things in the lab. We often make these distinctions like I'm testing emotion effects on memory, and in this other paradigm, in this different way of doing things, I'm testing motivation effects on memory. But I think, in the real world, when you think about any experience that you've had, most likely both of those things are kind of co-occurring where you're having some level of, reward motivation to reach your goal is also going to involve, positive and maybe negative emotions as you, you know, take two steps forward, one step back towards that goal. And so, the way that we do things in the lab, we're trying really hard to really narrow in on like where I'm studying negative emotion. Um, and so there you might, as you were saying, you might get just activation in the amygdala because of the way that we have operationalized things or the type of stimuli that we're using or the very specific, you know, constrained way that we are testing people in the lab, but that in real life probably isn't the way things work. So for example, if you go to the casino and you're gambling and you're trying to win some money, you're like got this reward motivation and maybe some loss motivation and loss avoidance motivation happening. There's also, a level of like positive emotion happening there. Um, as you win, you get excited. And so probably in those kinds of situations, you're getting, activation in all of these regions together and they're talking to each other. It's only in the way that we do it in the lab where we really are separating these things and constraining them in ways uh, with the type of stimuli, the type of paradigms we're kind of enforcing these boundaries where we might see that in some situations we get amygdala activation and in other situations we get striatum activation.
It's really interesting that gambling can be so addicting when it tends to be net loss, even though you have the random intermittent jackpot rewards, because we have such a strong loss aversion bias in other contexts. Like if you ask people, would you rather have a would you take a bet where you have a 50-50 shot of, say, losing $10 or winning $11? The expected value is positive on average. You repeat that, you'll win a dollar. I think most people won't do it, but you say, if it was 50-50 to win $20, then win $10, then it starts to sound pretty attractive. But with gambling, not only are the margins in favor of the casinos, but the margins are also very slim. It's actually more similar to you lose $11, but you could win $10. And if people get so fixated on it, and the classic theory, like you mentioned, a lot of these lab studies are just done not in an ecologically valid context. You would think that then you're just going to associate all those repeated losses with the slot machine. You're going to form a negative amygdala representation of the slot machine. You're just going to like kick it and walk away. But in practice, some people can just be glued to it.
Yeah, so I think you're right. For the most part, most people don't have gambling addictions, and they're able to make that association that, gambling is associated more with losses. And you might choose to take those losses because it's exciting to go to the casino, right? There's other reasons you might go there and gamble because there's lights and lots of people around, and there's kind of an entertainment value to it. And so you might be willing to take those losses just for these other things that are happening. But at a broader level, you understand, like, for the most part, you're going to lose. For other people, when it becomes, a problem, so Kent Berridge has a nice way of thinking about things, of liking versus wanting. And I think in that situation, you could think about, gambling, addictions, or, other types of addictions where your wanting system is maybe dysfunctional in some way. So you kind of continue to want to gamble, even if you don't like it. So you can
Mhm.
have this kind of disordered, sort of reward system, but still at the same time realize, like, I don't want to be doing this. I understand this is harmful for me, but I can't stop it. So you could think about this also with things like drug addiction or disordered eating. I don't want it to be like this, but I can't stop or I don't like it to be like this, but I can't stop that wanting.
Yeah, the addiction research, particularly animal studies with drug addiction, that makes a lot of sense because we're talking about the same type of dopamine system, but there's the learning component as well. And I guess conceptually, I haven't made such a strong connection to this and memory in the past, but it makes sense that any form of learning intrinsically requires memory. And I just haven't thought critically about what is happening, like with the pharmacological effects of those drugs. How is it actually influencing the memory encoding or the memory consolidation?
So drugs, you mean that affect the dopamine system?
Right. So when I was thinking earlier, experimental manipulation, I guess it doesn't have to necessarily just be manipulating dopamine directly. It could even be something like, I guess, all of the animal studies looking at opiate addiction, because opiates are dopaminergic, right?
Mhm.
So that would work the same way.
Yeah. So there are some studies where researchers have tried to increase dopamine levels, not with drugs necessarily, but by having them watch like funny videos. So I can't remember the researcher's name off the top of my head, but they had one group of participants watch a Charlie Chaplin video to kind of boost their dopamine, and another group of participants watch sort of like a neutral video, and then had them do some cognitive tasks afterwards. And you actually do see kind of differences um, between those two groups just by kind of boosting, I mean, theoretically boosting. They weren't actually measuring it, theoretically boosting dopamine by kind of engaging those systems with external stimuli.
Mhm. So now, again, I'm trying to connect this to the fear conditioning studies that I'm more familiar with. So, like, people talk about these negative flashbulb memories. What you're saying here seems to suggest that maybe it's valence more generally. So, it could be positive valence as well that's dopamine driven, and it's just any form of intense emotion boosts memory. And I know you have a theoretical model about that I want to talk about. But thinking just at the neurotransmitter level, that's also hard for me to understand because, well, dopamine boost, if it's the dopamine boost that boosts emotion, well, then anytime it's a negative event, you might experience this dopamine dip. And yet, most of these flashbulb memories that people talk about are negative.
Right. And so I think other neurotransmitters might come into play here that are also tied to learning and memory. So I think some people would argue that, yes, maybe dopamine could be beneficial for learning and memory, but also things like norepinephrine, which
Hmm.
might get released during like a negative or highly arousing stimulus or experience would also boost, learning and memory. So sort of in an adaptive way, when you experience something traumatic or arousing, that the locus coeruleus and would release, some norepinephrine, and this is going to, kind of tag that memory for,
Uh-huh.
for later use.
Uh-huh. Okay, so because I don't know much about other neurotransmitters, when I hear norepinephrine and when I'm trying to connect it to this sort of fear-based arousal, I'm hearing adrenaline, but I
Mm.
know epinephrine, adrenaline, and norepinephrine are different things. How are they different here in this emotion context?
A little out of my wheelhouse. So,
Uh-huh.
um, I mean, I guess, yeah, I don't have a good answer for that because it's a little out of my um, area of expertise. But there's lots of work from, for example, Maren Mather's lab that's really focusing on norepinephrine, and it's tied to kind of emotional memory. Uh, but I would say their work is mostly focused on arousal rather than a
Mhm.
valence effect.
Right. Yeah, that's and I know you don't have the answers. I'm just thinking out loud here because I know adrenaline is also arousal and cortisol is also
Mm.
arousal. So all these are they seem to kind of co-vary, but I don't know which is which if you say like this one is doing that thing and this was a slightly different
Yeah.
form of arousal and what is unique to these different contexts. But anyway, I know theoretically all of this, like regardless of which neurotransmitters are facilitating that arousal, this contributes to this never forget model of emotional memory that you have. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So this was a model that we proposed. This is stemming from some of my work as a postdoc working with Elizabeth Kensinger at Boston College. So we had done some empirical work looking at recapitulation. So what I mean by that is looking at the neural activity during encoding of a stimulus and examining how that compares to, or is it similar to, when you are recollecting that stimulus later at retrieval and looking at the neural activity during retrieval. And so recapitulation is just sort of this reactivation of neural processes from encoding at the time of retrieval. And we were really interested in looking at recapitulation processes for negative versus positive information. So we had done a couple of different versions of a task where participants were in the MRI scanner and encoded some emotional stimuli. And then at retrieval, we cued them to that stimulus, but not actually showing them the original stimulus. So in my studies, we had a neutral word paired with an emotional, positive, negative, or neutral image. And at retrieval, we just showed them the word. And we looked to see if there was reactivation in some regions that they had used to encode that stimulus originally coming back online and whether that reactivation was tied to memory, but also whether there was differences in reactivation or recapitulation by the valence of that stimulus. So at retrieval, we never show them the emotional information again. They're just bringing it back to mind. What we were finding in these empirical studies was negative emotion was really leading to reactivation in ventral visual processing regions. So more of these kind of sensory regions of your brain, visual cortex, to a much greater extent than positive or neutral. Um, and so this led us to propose this new model called Never Forget. So never standing for negative emotion enhances recapitulation. Negative emotional valence enhances recapitulation. And there we really were looking at or talking about how negative emotion in particular is going to lead to sensory focused encoding. And that is going to then also lead to sensory processes being recapitulated at the time of retrieval. And that this might explain why, when we have a negative emotion, that we typically tend to describe a negative memory, we typically tend to describe those memories as being very vivid, very that you're like re-experiencing or reliving that event at the time of retrieval, as if you are, mentally traveling back to the time of encoding. And this happens to a much greater extent for negative compared to positive memory. So when people are describing these negative memories, they feel very vivid, or that they're re-experiencing very vivid, sensory processes that they had originally encoded. And so we created this model to try and explain some of that kind of re-experiencing, kind of subjective differences that people report between negative and positive memories.
The thinking about all this in context of our discussion on valence and negativity bias, I'm still wondering how much of this is something that's really unique about negative emotion, like the qualia of it, as opposed to negative emotion tends to be the most high arousal emotion in general. And so there's a strong bias towards there. But I wonder what would happen if you asked people, say, to reflect on, or if you elicited emotion that was mildly negative versus intensely positive, and then maybe the bias works out such that the positive, strong valence emotion could have a similar effect. Or would you say that the model's different enough that even if it was more mild, there's something intrinsic about negative emotion that
Yeah, so we were arguing that even when you control for valence, or even when you control for other aspects of the visual information, like brightness or luminance or things like that, that may differ between positive and negative images, that you would still see these effects, that you would still find that people describe their memories for negative information, um, with more detail, with kind of more confidence, with more sensory detail
Mhm.
than positive. And so even if you could equate positive and negative, which is often difficult to do on arousal, um, that we would still see this effect.
So I think I'm proposing something that's a little bit different from controlling for valence, because this would be something like assuming that there's a negativity bias, then how can you, it's not controlling for valence on an absolute level, but like control for things such that, well, you're comparing mild negative versus extreme positive, and then would you see an extreme positive effect that looks more similar to the classic negative effect? Does that
I
make
see.
sense?
I see. So if the arousal levels were just so disproportionate, so positive was extremely high arousal and the negative was low arousal, would you still see
Right.
this effect?
Hmm.
Um, I mean, I think you would to a certain extent. So I think in that case, you probably would get better memory accuracy. So you might get objective differences between negative and positive, but the quality of the memory or the details that you bring to mind from that memory, I think you would still find that negative information is subjectively different than positive.
Hmm. I'm also wondering about novelty effects, and this might connect to some of the age and memory and learning research that you touched on. So, if something is more intensely emotional one way or the other, there's probably going to be some prediction error. So it's probably like either a really positive surprise, or like a jump scare is probably going to be more scary than just seeing the same scary image on the screen, but it's static and not moving because of the surprise component. So I think there's a lot of research that shows that having that sort of surprise, that prediction error, is going to more strongly influence encoding. But then where it connects to the aging research, and this might apply more to early development, which I know is more outside your area, but there's this thought of how memory connects to perception, and that over time with age, as you become more familiar with an environment, you're maybe perceiving it less and you're just working more so through memory. So things become automatized a lot, and that increases with age. So as that happens, I also wonder if this emotional surprise factor tends to decrease. So if you were encountering basically the same positive or negative events, but say in a place you grew up your whole life and you feel like you know how things go versus you just moved to a new town. This kind of connects to the adolescent research where people talk about memory biases nostalgia wise, that a lot of times it's that adolescent period that really stands out to people even decades later. And I think there's still ongoing debate about is that something brain development wise that it's these higher order cognitive networks that are maturing at this age, so those are what stand out the most? Or is it sort of confounded by novelty because in Western culture, this tends to be the age where maybe you're moving out of the house and just accumulating a whole bunch of new experiences in a pretty condensed time that happens to coincide with maturation of your brain, but maybe it's more about the experience. So maybe if you immigrate at a much later age, then you'd have nostalgia for that period of your time. And it's really just the rapid learning part that drives these.
So in this context, I don't know that there's necessarily a prediction error in the way that you might kind of think about um, where you get an unexpected outcome, you know? So for example, in like motivation studies, if you thought that you won the money and then you actually didn't win the money, here in this paradigm, I don't know that we actually are eliciting a prediction error in that way. Um, so participants are seeing actually in a lot of our studies very neutral stimuli that
Mhm.
had been previously paired with with an emotional stimulus. But we actually don't in these studies ask them to associate the emotional image with the word. We don't tell them we're going to test them in any way on the emotional image. We tell them upfront we're testing your memory for the neutral word. So they, at the time of encoding, know what's going to happen at retrieval. And we in no way tell them, anything about emotion. We don't test them on the emotion. We're only testing them on these neutral words, and yet we're still seeing this activation in the brain that really differentiates what had previously been paired with something negative and something positive. So I don't think they're expecting a prediction error in the sense that they thought they were going to be tested on the emotional stimulus and then they weren't, or something like that. They know right up front that this is what they're going to be tested on. And actually, we do study test blocks, so they don't actually see or get tested on any of the emotional images at all.
You hear I'm thinking less about your particular study paradigms and more about lifespan development and emotion and memory more broadly. Like again, with this nostalgia effect, I don't know if your research bears on this, but just that question of do these salient emotional memory periods, like the time that you're most nostalgic about, whatever sensory stimulus in your environment triggers that, like the smell of cookies that remind you of your grandmother, whatever the thing might be, is that something unique to plasticity at different phases of the lifespan, or is it more unique to novelty? And that novelty is something like prediction error in your environment.
So I think there's probably different things going on here. So when you're talking about younger adults and they're having all these transition periods, and you're creating all these new and novel experiences or having all these novel experiences, I think there's a lot of work to suggest that novelty is, triggering for or creates sets your brain up to create a durable memory. Um, and so I can see how that works in younger adults. As you age, we know, memory performance declines just, overall. And older adults are having probably fewer novel experiences. And so it may be the case that, older adults, um, if this is kind of what you're what you're getting at, that older adults may not be having some of those novel experiences, and they're not remembering um, things in the same way, but they can remember those experiences from younger adulthood because they had created such a strong memory trace because of the
Mm.
novelty and then these new experiences and transition experiences that older adults seem to carry with them, their whole entire lives. If you ask them about their autobiographical memories from across their lifespan, they disproportionately report more memories from, ages 10 to 30. And lots of studies have shown that
Mhm.
reminiscence bounce. Yeah.
The other interesting thing about the memory decline is it, and here I'm not talking about cognitive tasks so much as just generally the way that older people might reflect on their lives. There does seem to be the opposite of the negativity bias that we generally talk about in psychology. It's almost like a nostalgia bias, and maybe that's motivated reasoning. Like the older you get, the it's just is adaptive to view your life more positively. But if you're thinking in a very narrow way, you might predict the opposite. Like if it's going to be the most high valence, high arousal memories that stick around as you age, and the weakest ones are the first to fall, then with this negativity bias, you might expect this would be a really cynical way. I'm glad it doesn't work, but that as you age, like all your positive memories start to fade because those are less strongly encoded, and then only the negative memories happen. But if anything, you seem to get the opposite. You seem to get more this nostalgia, and there's this saying like the best explanation for the good old days is a bad memory.
Yeah. So, yeah, you're right. As you age, we tend to see a positivity bias in memory. And so, I don't know if it's the case that older adults are forgetting their positive memories and only the negative ones are sticking around. But I think what happens in age is older adults put a positive spin on those negative memories. And so
Mhm,
they're not remembering them as, I mean, certainly that, there's points in their life where, there's grief or other things where there's these negative memories and they would say like those are negative memories. But they may put these rose-colored glasses on and say, "But that taught me this, or this led me here." And so, with some distance from that memory,
mhm,
you now have this ability to frame it in a different way, which older adults seem to frame in more of a positive light. And so, yes, of course, they would still describe that as being a hard time in their life,
mhm,
or a negative memory, but they can take something from it that is more positive in a way that maybe younger adults don't do or can't do. Maybe you need that closure, or you need that distance away from it to see, how the rest of your life plays out.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and they'll have more crystallized knowledge and just life experience of how the world works. So you can look at younger people, including like thinking about your own past, with
Mhm.
some level of understanding and sympathy. Especially, I haven't experienced this yet, but you hear about how once you become a parent, then you look back on your own childhood and any parent's mistakes with a lot more sympathy because it's hard. So it's that
Yeah,
positive
exactly.
reappraisal.
Yeah, exactly. So you realize, why your parents made those decisions, why they were, had those rules for you. Yeah, you can better appreciate that.
This sounds like a promising area for intervention type research that even if this is something adaptive that we learn to do more with age, this positive reappraisal, that you could probably teach people to do it earlier and you could teach people with more negative ruminative strategies to do it. Do you know of any research in that space?
So maybe not exactly in the way that you're talking about it, but one way that researchers have been trying to get younger adults to look more like older adults in this respect is to manipulate how much time they think they have left to live. So, sort of underlying one of the main theories as to why older adults show this positivity bias is the socioemotional selectivity theory, which suggests that as you age, you realize, you have less time left to live. And this motivates you to have this shift in your mindset that you want to prioritize, your emotional well being, um, rather than, when you're younger and you're really prioritizing knowledge and learning and new experiences. And so, one way that that some people have been trying to get younger adults to look like older adults in sort of this positivity bias way is having them think about, and manipulate kind of experimentally how much time they think they have left to live, and then sort of testing to see. And some have been successful at doing this. They don't always look exactly as positive as older adults, but they can get them a little bit closer than people who
Hmm.
didn't undergo the intervention or manipulation.
Yeah, I don't know if you've experienced this as an academic or even just growing up, if people called you an old soul. I think that makes me rethink that. And it makes a lot of sense because people talk about this sort of bias of youth, like you think you have so much time, you're kind of reckless. I've never been like that. If anything, I've been too anxious and always moving on to the next thing, like with grad school. And that old soul mentality, if it's for whatever reason you feel like you don't have as much time, you relate to the older people and that motivates you. I imagine grad students are going to disproportionately feel that way. You don't
Yes,
have enough time.
yeah, I have definitely been told that I'm an old soul. I've also heard, some people say, when people say that about you, it means that you were just given way more responsibility in your life than than you were supposed to have at a young age. But
Uh-huh.
um, you had to take things on maybe that were above your kind of pay grade at that age. But yeah, I've definitely been told that, which is, yeah, interesting because I do think it comes more with this negative emotion and anxiety and feeling, like you don't have enough time left, and it kind of stresses you out to
Right.
get all the things done that you want to do, which is kind of the opposite of how older adults feel, I guess. And when I say what the things that I'm talking about here, I'm talking about healthy older adults as well. So in a lot of my work, what we're showing these effects where older adults can do things the same way as younger adults, or they can do so with more recruitment of prefrontal cortex, or they're showing a positivity bias. All of this, I'm putting in the context of kind of healthy aging, and what I mean by that is, not showing signs of dementia. Um, it doesn't mean that they don't have some chronic illness or they're not on medications or something like that. But generally speaking, they're in the healthier range for their age.
Hmm. Yeah, again, I'm coming from a lot of this more from the perspective of early child development, but I know there's research on how stress, this being a parentified child or having early adverse experiences, it literally physiologically ages you, whether that's with cortisol levels, DNA methylation, hippocampal shrinkage, and then this is connecting to your area because hippocampus shrinks as you age. So those children with the high cortisol levels, with the shrunk hippocampi, well, literally just physiologically they're older, but I guess there are some adaptive benefits that trade off with that.
Yeah. So I think, you know, the difference there between older adults who are showing, signs of age related changes to their hippocampus or other areas of their brain versus, adults who are showing these age related changes because of adverse events from their childhood. One thing that may be different between them is older adults who are healthy and didn't have those adverse childhood experiences were able to build up, cognitive reserve, or build up these, um, sort of this. in- There's another theory about scaffolding. You build up scaffolding in your brain and your abilities, so that when you start to decline, you can bring on these like additional resources that you've built up in this. You can rely on this reserve to help you compensate for some of those changes. On the other end, you may not have the ability to build up that reserve or build up that scaffolding if you've experienced, some of this adverse childhood, um, had these adverse childhood experiences like neglect or abuse. And so they may not fare as well with these age related changes as older adults who are showing similar changes.
I've wondered why the hippocampus shrinks with this type of adversity and why you see memory impairment, because the theory when we're talking about fear conditioning and this sort of threat-based learning that the amygdala is involved in, you could predict the opposite. Like if anything, maybe you'd have an enlarged hippocampus that was disproportionately sensitive to encoding all these threat related experiences. And you do seem to have that, at least just in terms of these flashbulb negative memories. So would you say that it's that you see this enlarged amygdala and those negative experiences stand out, but then memory for everything else that's less valenced, that's where you see the impairment and that's what the shrinkage represents?
I mean, it's hard to say. The first thing that kind of comes to mind is generalization. So, or overgeneralizing. And so it may be the case that actually in people who have a smaller hippocampus, that their memory isn't that great, but they're just kind of overgeneralizing or really, yeah, I guess overgeneralizing that negative affect onto kind of all experiences and so their memory isn't as detailed. They're not able to apply that information to specific contexts or specific people in the same way that you might if you had a higher functioning hippocampus or a larger hippocampus, for example.
This is another paradox in context of these cortisol and norepinephrine effects, because if those, at least in the short term, they actually facilitate memory consolidation, but then if they're chronically high, somehow you get the opposite effect.
Yeah, exactly. And you also see even in the short term sort of this inverted U shape. So even in the short term, if you have too little or too much stress, for example, your memory suffers. So if you have too much cortisol, even in the short term, you may actually see a memory impairment. There's sort of a sweet spot in between, which there may be individual differences in, of course, where cortisol helps, or adrenaline helps, or these things are helpful for memory, but on the lower or higher ends, even in the short term, are harmful for memory.
Holly, what are the future or current ongoing projects you're excited to talk about? Any open questions you want to bring up?
Yeah. So one of the things, and we haven't really talked about this much, but so we brought up the idea of the positivity bias in memory and in older age. And as I mentioned, a lot of this work has been done in healthy aging. So people who are, for the most part, actually not on a lot of medications or not on any medications. They're really showing, high levels of cognition. They're sort of comfortably retired. And we don't really know much about other, well, that's not really representative of older adults more broadly. And so we don't know exactly when and in whom these positivity effects show up, or this positivity bias shows up. And so one of the things that I am starting right now is kind of along with my colleague Stephanie Wilson, combining physiology, neuroimaging, gerontology, cognition all into one study to try and pinpoint, um, s- you know, how is this positivity bias emerging and in whom? So in this study, we are um, bringing older adults in from the community who um, range on health. So we are excluding anyone with signs of dementia, but including older adults who typically are excluded from cognitive research who are on medications and may have other health problems. And we're having them do a bunch of things in the lab. So one thing we're collecting is heart rate and heart rate variability along with respiration. And we are having them do some emotional memory tasks in the lab. And we're looking to see whether heart rate variability, which has been tied to anything and everything recently, but mostly we're interested in heart rate variability and its role in kind of cognitive control processes. So, another paradox of aging is that cognitive control processes decline with age. It's pretty well established, but and older adults also show, you know, reduced heart rate variability. So as you age, your heart rate variability declines. But older adults are also better at things like emotion regulation, which seemingly relies on cognitive control. And so we're kind of tying these things together, which have been studied kind of separately. So, yes, heart rate variability is tied to cognitive control. Older adults are better at emotion regulation, and that might be tied to heart rate variability as well. But these have all been kind of studied in separate domains. And so we're looking at the role of heart rate variability and its role in an emotional memory test that relies on cognitive control. So we're doing two different tasks. One's a working memory task where older adults are looking at abstract shapes while they then get distracted by positive, negative, or neutral images. They have to keep that shape in mind and then do a little memory test. Is this the shape you were keeping in mind or not? And then another is directed forgetting. So here, older adults are told, some of these items are important, you should remember them, and other items are cued to be forgotten. So you show them the item, but then they're told you could just forget that item. We're not going to test you on it. And these are words that are positive, negative, and neutral. And of course, we test them on all of the items, and we look to see how well they can cognitively control their encoding processes, and whether that varies by valence. So we're tying their performance on these tasks of cognitive control and memory with emotional stimuli to their heart rate variability, with the idea that older adults with higher heart rate variability, which is a metric of health, so higher heart rate variability is good, that those older adults will show better memory performance overall, higher levels of cognitive control, and will be showing the positivity bias compared to those um, who have lower heart rate variability. We're also putting some of those people into the MRI scanner to look to see what's going on in the brain, if this is tied to actual frontal lobe function while they're doing an emotion regulation task in the scanner. So in the scanner, we're testing heart rate variability as well, but looking actually at task related heart rate variability rather than just kind of resting baseline.
Do you have any hunches for why older adults tend to be better at emotion regulation in this non-cognitive way?
Yes. So there's a lot of theories about why. So one is maybe just experience, that they, you know, are have had a lot of situations where they've had to regulate their emotions and they just get into a groove of doing it a particular way. And so they're, good at it. Um, Another theory
Can I jump
is,
in there for the experience one?
yeah,
Because
sure.
you might say that cognitive control should increase as well throughout the lifespan with more experience, but you see this sort of dissociability there.
Yes. So most of that is tied to frontal lobe function. So cognitive control tends to decrease as we see deterioration in the frontal lobe. Even in healthy aging, you see that the frontal lobe starts to shrink, or parts of the frontal lobe start to shrink, and that seems to be tied to kind of cognitive control. Which is the paradox here because emotion regulation also relies on these same
Hmm.
mechanisms. So it can't be that. So the experience might come in. There's also just, the socio emotional selectivity theory would suggest that older adults are just um, motivated to focus more on positives, that they can change things into a positive situation with these rose-colored glasses, and that's how they're doing this. So they can down regulate that negative emotion better because they're motivated to do so in a way that younger adults are not. Those are just kind of two theories. I don't think we have the exact answer yet, but we're also, thinking about how heart rate variability might play into this relationship as well.
That's exciting. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Well, this was great, Holly. I learned a lot from you. Thank you
Cool.
for your time.
Thanks for having me. This is fun.